There is something deeply unsettling about a person who is always, without exception, unfailingly kind. Not kind in the way a generous soul is kind, warm, spontaneous, genuine, but kind in the particular way of someone who cannot stop, someone who apologizes when you bump into them, someone who says yes before the question is even finished, someone who smiles through pain with such consistency that the smile itself has become a kind of armor, polished, impenetrable, and hollow at its center. You may know this person, or you may be this person, and if you are, there is something Carl Jung discovered about you, something he spent decades trying to warn the world about, that is more disturbing than anything you have been told about your darkness, your flaws, or your past. Because Jung's warning was not about your worst qualities, it was about your best one. Jung's warning was about your niceness. He observed, across thousands of hours of clinical work and philosophical study, that the people most celebrated for their goodness, the helpers, the peacekeepers, the ones who never raised their voice, never asked for too much, never caused trouble, were often the most psychologically fractured people in any room, not because they were secretly bad, but because they had committed an act of profound violence against themselves. They had taken everything that was real, complicated, inconvenient, and powerful inside them, and buried it so deeply, smiled over it so completely, that they themselves no longer knew it was there. He called what lived in that burial ground the shadow, and he believed, with the full weight of his clinical and philosophical conviction, that the shadow does not stay buried. It waits. This is the beginning of everything Jung understood about niceness, and it is where your story, if you are honest with yourself, probably begins too. Think back, not to a recent memory, further back. Back to the first time you learned that the way you felt inside was not acceptable to the people whose love you needed most. Maybe you were angry, and anger was met with withdrawal. Maybe you were loud, and loudness was punished with silence. Maybe you wanted too much, needed too much, took up too much space. And the message came, clearly and repeatedly, that taking up space was dangerous. So you made yourself smaller. You learned to read the room before you spoke. You learned to swallow your hunger and call it contentment. You learned that the version of you that was quiet, accommodating, and agreeable was the version that got held, that got praised, that got to stay. And slowly, without ever making a single conscious decision, you built a self, a performing self, a self that Jung called the persona, the mask we construct from the expectations of our environment, worn so constantly and so completely that we eventually forget it is a mask at all. And the tragedy, the one Jung spent his entire career trying to illuminate, is that this mask does not protect you. It imprisons you. But here is what Jung discovered that goes deeper than any of this. The mask of niceness is not neutral. It is not simply a defense mechanism or a coping strategy or a learned behavior that can be gently unlearned in therapy. It is something far more charged than that. Because for every quality that was acceptable and therefore absorbed into the persona, there was an equal and opposite quality that was not acceptable, and that quality did not disappear. It went underground. It became shadow. This is the first and most fundamental truth Jung discovered about people who are too nice. Your niceness is not the absence of darkness. It is the measure of it. The more radically kind you perform yourself to be, the more radically unkind you have been forced to become toward your own interior life. Every smile that masked real anger is a piece of anger that found nowhere to go. Every yes that should have been a no is a boundary that was never built. Every moment you comforted someone else while swallowing your own pain is a piece of pain that went unwitnessed and unprocessed, compressed into the shadow like coal under unimaginable pressure. And coal under enough pressure becomes something else entirely. Jung observed this transformation in patient after patient. He wrote about the peculiar nature of repression, that it never actually eliminates the thing being repressed. It amplifies it. It intensifies it. It gives it the strange, distorted power of everything that has been denied. The anger you were never allowed to feel does not disappear. It becomes the inexplicable rage that surfaces when someone makes a minor criticism of your work. The grief you were never allowed to express does not evaporate. It becomes the depression that arrives without apparent cause, at 3 in the morning, in the middle of what should be a perfectly fine life. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche understood something adjacent to this. He called it ressentiment, the particular poison that accumulates in people who cannot act on their deepest impulses, who cannot live honestly from their true nature, and who therefore begin to generate a subterranean resentment so profound it eventually turns inward and consumes them. Nietzsche was not writing about weakness. He was writing about what happens to strength when it is perpetually suppressed. Jung read Nietzsche carefully, and he agreed with the diagnosis, if not always the cure. Because the cure Jung was interested in was not aggression or self-assertion in the crude sense. It was integration. The radical, difficult, often terrifying process of retrieving everything that had been cast into the shadow and learning, painstakingly, honestly, to own it. But before we get to the cure, we need to understand the full depth of the wound, because here is what most people do not realize about excessive niceness, and this is where the psychology becomes genuinely disturbing. People who are too nice are not, at their core, selfless. They are, in a very specific psychological sense, among the most self-protective people alive. The niceness is not an absence of self-interest. It is a hyper-refined strategy of self-preservation. Every act of compulsive kindness is, at its root, driven by a single, relentless, largely unconscious calculation. If I am agreeable enough, helpful enough, small enough, invisible enough, then no one will leave. Then no one will punish me. Then I will be safe. Think about the person you know, or the version of yourself, who can be in genuine pain, and yet, the moment someone else in the room has a problem, completely abandons their own pain to address someone else's, who cannot receive a compliment without immediately deflecting it, who experiences a physical sensation of anxiety at the thought of disappointing someone, who lies awake at night replaying conversations, searching for moments when they might have said something wrong, something too much, something that might have pushed the other person away. This is not generosity. Jung was clear about this distinction. Generosity flows from fullness, from a person who has enough of themselves to give some away. Compulsive niceness flows from fear, from a person who is giving away pieces of themselves because they believe that is the only currency they have to offer. The truly generous person can say no. The compulsively nice person experiences no as a kind of psychological death. This is the second dangerous truth about being too nice. It is a form of emotional debt accumulation you do not even know you are incurring. Every time you say yes when you mean no, you are writing a check you will eventually have to cash. Every time you suppress genuine emotion to maintain a relationship's equilibrium, you are borrowing from a psychological account that has limits. And Jung observed again and again that the moment of reckoning always comes, not as a conscious decision, not as a deliberate rebellion, but as a collapse. The body breaks down. The depression arrives that cannot be explained or reasoned away. The relationship that was supposed to be built on such pure, selfless love turns suddenly and catastrophically cold. The smile falls off the face, not because the person decided to remove it, but because they simply no longer have the energy to hold it there. Let us place a character inside this moment. Her name is Sarah. Sarah has been, by every external measure, A wonderful person her entire life. Her colleagues depend on her. Her friends call her first in a crisis. Her family has always known that Sarah will absorb the difficulty so that they do not have to. Sarah has rarely raised her voice. She has rarely demanded anything. She has been, in the language of the social world she inhabits, an extraordinarily good person. But at 38 years old, Sarah wakes up one morning and cannot get out of bed. Not because she is physically ill, but because something inside her has stopped. Some engine that has been running since childhood, the engine that generates patience, selflessness, perpetual availability, has finally, without warning, run out of fuel. And in the weeks that follow, what surfaces is not what Sarah expected. It is not sadness, though sadness is there. It is rage, a rage so vast and so old that Sarah barely recognizes it as her own. Rage at having been used, rage at having allowed herself to be used, rage at the 20 years of relationships in which she gave everything and received, if she is honest, far less than she ever deserved. Rage at herself, most of all, for having been so afraid of abandonment that she had abandoned herself first. This is what Jung called the eruption of the shadow. And it is the most important moment in a person's psychological life, because it is the moment when the real work can finally begin. But here is what nobody tells you about that moment, and this is the third truth Jung uncovered that most people are deeply uncomfortable hearing. When the shadow erupts, it does not look like growth. It looks like destruction. The people around Sarah, the people who have benefited most from her niceness, who have been cushioned by her endlessness, experience her awakening not as liberation, but as betrayal. She is told she has changed. She is told she has become selfish. She is told, with varying degrees of subtlety, that the version of her that gave everything and asked for nothing was the real Sarah, and that this new version, this Sarah who has boundaries, who says no, who expects reciprocity, is some corrupted, damaged aberration. This is one of the most psychologically violent things that can happen to a person in the process of individuation. Jung used that word, individuation, to describe the lifelong process of becoming who you actually are, as distinct from who you were shaped to be. He believed it was the most essential human task. He also believed it was the most resisted, not just by the individual, but by the systems around them. Because every system, every family, every relationship structure, every social dynamic has a vested interest in its members remaining as they are. Change is experienced as destabilization. Growth is experienced as threat. And so the person who is too nice and who begins, for the first time, to push back against that niceness will face a very specific and very cruel form of resistance. They will be made to feel that their growth is actually their regression, that their awakening is actually their wounding, that the very movement toward psychological health is, in fact, a moral failure. Marcus Aurelius, writing his private meditations in the solitude of military campaigns, understood something about this pressure. He wrote about the necessity of acting from the interior rather than performing for the exterior, of governing yourself by your own philosophical principles rather than by the mirror of other people's approval. He was describing, in the language of Stoicism, what Jung would later describe in the language of depth psychology, the catastrophic psychological cost of building your identity on the responses of others. Because here is the fourth truth about being too nice, and it is the one that cuts deepest. You do not actually know who you are. If your sense of self has been constructed primarily from external feedback, from the warmth that arrived when you were agreeable, the approval that came when you were helpful, the belonging that was granted when you were small, then you have not built a self. You have built a mirror, a highly sophisticated mirror that reflects back to each person exactly what they want to see. And mirrors, no matter how beautiful, are empty at their center. Jung called this the central crisis of the person who has overinvested in the persona. They have mistaken the mask for the face. They have been performing the role so completely and for so long that they have lost contact with any genuine sense of interior life. Ask them what they want, truly want, and they will pause. Ask them what they feel, genuinely feel, and there will be a strange, unmistakable hesitation. Because the access routes to authentic feeling and authentic desire have been blocked for so long, they have almost stopped functioning. This is not a minor inconvenience. This is a fundamental loss of self. And it creates a very particular kind of loneliness, a loneliness that is paradoxically most intense in the middle of social warmth. The person who is too nice is often surrounded by people who adore them, and yet they experience, at the core of all that adoration, a profound and aching disconnection, because the person being adored is not them. It is the performance. The people in the room are in love with the mirror. And the real person, the unperformed, unedited, genuinely complex person, is standing just behind that mirror in the dark, unknown and unknowing, starving for a contact that the mask prevents from ever arriving. Leave a comment below if you have ever felt loved by people who you knew, on some level, did not actually know you, because that comment section is going to tell us something very important about how many people are living inside this experience right now. But here is what Jung discovered that moves us beyond the diagnosis and into something altogether more transformative. The shadow is not the enemy. This is perhaps Jung's most counterintuitive and most liberating insight. We are conditioned, in every culture and tradition, to understand our darkness as the thing to be overcome, to be prayed away, medicated away, shamed away, suppressed below the surface of the civilized self. Jung turned this understanding completely on its head. He argued that the shadow contains not just the worst of you, but the most vital of you. That buried in the disowned basement of your psyche, alongside the suppressed anger and the unprocessed grief and the forbidden desires, is also the creative power you were told was too much. The passion you were taught to dim, the ambition that was called arrogance, the voice that was called too loud, the needs that were called too demanding. He wrote that the shadow is 90% pure gold. Consider what that means for a moment. The part of yourself that you have been taught to be most ashamed of, most afraid of, most careful to conceal, contains, according to Jung, the majority of your unlived potential. Your niceness has not been protecting the world from your darkness. It has been protecting your darkness from being transformed into something extraordinary. The Indian philosophical tradition offers a parallel understanding through the concept of Kundalini, the idea that there is a vast, coiled energy at the base of the human being that, when properly awakened and integrated, rises through the system as creative and spiritual power. When suppressed, it does not disappear. It festers, it generates neurosis, physical illness, and existential despair. When liberated and consciously directed, it becomes the most powerful creative force available to a human life. Jung studied Eastern philosophy with serious intent. He corresponded with scholars of Hinduism and Buddhism. He was not borrowing metaphors superficially. He was recognizing, across radically different philosophical systems, a convergent truth. The suppression of authentic energy does not produce peace. It produces pathology. And the integration of that energy, the willingness to face what has been buried and reclaim it, does not produce chaos. It produces wholeness. This brings us to the fifth dangerous truth about being too nice, and it is the one that explains everything that has confused you about your relationships. The people who exploit the excessively nice are not, in most cases, deliberately malicious. They are simply responding to the psychological contract that the excessively nice person has unconsciously established. By never saying no, you communicate that no is not an option. By absorbing everything without complaint, you communicate that absorption is your function. By making yourself endlessly available, you communicate that your time and energy are inexhaustible resources that exist for others' use. You have not attracted takers because you are unlucky. You have attracted takers because you have, without knowing it, been advertising for them. And this is the devastating reciprocal of Jung's insight about the shadow. Just as your suppressed anger exists in your unconscious, your willingness to be treated as a resource exists in the unconscious of the relationships you create. The dynamic is not random. It is a psychological ecosystem, and you have been its most essential architect. This is not blame. Jung was never interested in blame. Blame is what we use when we want to feel the temporary relief of locating responsibility somewhere outside ourselves. What Jung was interested in was agency, the radical, uncomfortable, profoundly empowering recognition that if you created the dynamic, you can change it. But changing it requires something most excessively nice people have been carefully trained to avoid. It requires disappointment. Specifically, it requires your willingness to disappoint people, not to hurt them, not to abandon them, but to be willing, for the first time in your life, to stand in the full presence of their disappointment, their frustration, their confusion, their narrative that you have become selfish or difficult or changed, and to remain standing anyway. This is what boundaries actually are. Not the calm, rehearsed phrases of self-help books, not the politely worded limits that still prioritize everyone else's comfort above your own reality. Real boundaries are an act of self-revelation. They are the moment when the real person behind the mirror steps forward and says, "This is who I am. This is what I will no longer agree to. This is what I need, what I feel, what I will not sacrifice." And they are terrifying, because every excessively nice person carries in the deepest part of their conditioning a fundamental belief that if people see who they really are, they will leave. That the authentic self is too much or not enough or simply unlovable without the performance. Jung called this fear the core wound of the persona, the belief that you are only acceptable in edited form. And here is what he discovered about that belief, which is the sixth truth we need to sit with. It is a lie. A lie told to you by people who were themselves too afraid to be seen in a world that punishes authenticity with remarkable consistency. But a lie nonetheless. Because the relationships built on the performance of niceness, on the edited, agreeable, undemanding version of you, are not real relationships. They are transactions, and transactions, however comfortable, cannot give you what you are actually starving for, which is to be known, genuinely, fully, uncomfortably known, shadows and all. The relationships that survive your awakening, the people who are still present after you stop performing, after the first real no, after the boundaries are drawn and the mask begins to come down. Those relationships are the real ones, and they are, Jung believed, the only ones worth having. There is a story Jung returned to repeatedly in his clinical work, not a patient story, but a mythological one. The story of Odysseus returning to Ithaca after 20 years of wandering, disguised as a beggar. The man who had been a king, a warrior, a hero of extraordinary capability, walked into his own palace in rags, and only those who truly knew him, the dog who had been waiting for 20 years, the wife whose intelligence had kept the household intact, recognized him beneath the disguise. The others saw only a beggar and treated him accordingly. Jung read this myth as a precise map of the psychological journey. We spend years in the palace of our own constructed identity, disguised even from ourselves, performing roles we were assigned before we were old enough to consent to them. The work of individuation is the work of return, of stripping back to what is true, of being willing to be seen as a beggar before you can stand as a king. The Stoics would recognize this language. Marcus Aurelius wrote repeatedly about the necessity of distinguishing between what appears to be the case and what actually is the case, between the socially constructed value of things and their actual worth. The approval of others, he argued, has no intrinsic value. It cannot be relied upon. It fluctuates with their moods, their needs, their own psychological darkness. To build your identity on it is to build on sand. Which brings us, at last, to the seventh and most important truth Jung discovered about people who are too nice. And it is the truth that changes everything. The moment you stop performing your niceness, the moment you allow the real, unedited, shadow-integrated version of yourself to step into the room, something that feels like danger is actually the beginning of freedom, because you become, for the first time in your life, genuinely unpredictable. And there is nothing in the social world more unsettling to those who have been feeding off your predictability than a person who can no longer be counted on to shrink. Jung understood that the integrated person, the person who has done the shadow work, who has retrieved the buried anger and the forgotten ambition and the suppressed desire and consciously owned all of it, is not a nicer person, not in the performed sense. They are, in fact, in many social contexts, more difficult, more willing to push back, less apologetic for their existence, less interested in smoothing over real conflicts with superficial warmth, less available for relationships that do not serve their genuine development. And they are also, paradoxically, more genuinely kind, because the kindness that flows from a person who has chosen it, who could say no, who has the full permission of their own integrated self to walk away, and who chooses instead to stay and help, that kindness is real. It is not fear wearing the costume of generosity. It is the actual thing. There is a moment in the psychology of transformation that Jung described with unusual precision. The moment when the shadow is not yet integrated, but is no longer fully suppressed. When it is surfacing, making itself known, beginning to demand the acknowledgement it was always owed. In that moment, the person who is too nice often experiences what feels like a personality crisis. They begin to notice their own resentment, which they find horrifying. They begin to feel the anger that was always there, which they experience as evidence of their fundamental badness. They start to pull back from relationships, not because they have decided to, but because something inside them simply cannot perform anymore. This is not breakdown. This is the beginning of integration. The philosopher and psychologist William James, writing at the turn of the 20th century, described what he called the divided self, the experience of living with an interior life radically at odds with the exterior self being presented to the world. He argued that the deepest human suffering was not poverty or illness or loss, but this particular division, the fracture between who you are and who you are performing yourself to be. Jung, who read James with attention, built an entire clinical architecture on the same insight. The divided self is exhausting, not just emotionally, but physiologically. The research in psychoneuroimmunology over the last 3 decades has repeatedly confirmed what Jung observed clinically. The suppression of authentic emotion has measurable, significant impacts on immune function, cardiovascular health, and neurological resilience. The nice person who never lets themselves feel what they actually feel is not just psychologically fragmented. They are, in a very literal biological sense, wearing their body down from the inside. The body, as Jung put it, keeps the score. Though he said it differently, he talked about how the psyche speaks through the body when it cannot speak through consciousness. The chronic back pain that arrives with the suppressed burden, the throat that closes up in the person who has never said what they mean, the exhaustion that comes not from overwork, but from the relentless expenditure of energy required to hold the mask in place. Take a moment. right now, watching this. Where in your body do you carry what you have never been able to say? Because Jung believed, and the research has steadily confirmed, that the integration of the shadow is not just a philosophical or a psychological necessity, it is a physiological one. Now let us talk about what shadow integration actually looks like. Because this is where the work becomes both more concrete and more demanding than most people expect. It does not look like suddenly becoming angry and calling it authenticity. It does not look like dropping all consideration for others and calling it self-love. Integration is not the performance of its opposite. It is the transcendence of the binary altogether. It is the capacity to hold both. To be genuinely kind without it costing you your truth. To be genuinely assertive without it becoming aggression. To be warm and also boundaried. Soft and also immovable on the things that matter. In the Buddhist philosophical tradition, this is understood through the concept of the middle path. Not the suppression of desire and anger and appetite, but the conscious relationship with them. The capacity to experience a powerful emotion fully without being destroyed by it and without inflicting it destructively on others. To feel the anger and choose what to do with it. To feel the desire and decide from a place of full awareness whether to act on it. This is what Jung meant by individuation, not the achievement of some idealized, perfectly integrated self. He was too honest a thinker for that. But the ongoing, never-completed process of bringing more and more of what is true about you into conscious relationship with how you live. Let us return to Sarah. 6 months after that morning when she could not get out of bed. She has sat with a therapist who did not try to restore her to her previous equilibrium. She has sat in the discomfort of her own rage and, rather than apologizing for it, has tried to understand what it is pointing at, what legitimate need it was always defending, what genuine boundary it was always demanding. She has, for the first time in decades, told a close friend the truth about something that was hurting her. She waited for the world to end. It did not end. The friend, the real friend, leaned in rather than away. She has also lost a relationship, someone who needed the old Sarah, the mirror, the absorber, the infinitely available caretaker, and who could not adjust to a Sarah who had an interior life she was no longer willing to hide. It hurt. It hurt with the particular pain of confirmation, the old belief whispering that this was always going to happen, that the real her was always going to be too much. But underneath the pain was something she had not expected: relief. The specific cellular relief of no longer pretending, of not having to calculate before every sentence whether this will be too much, whether this will cause them to withdraw, whether she needs to edit herself into something smaller and more acceptable. This is what Jung called the gift of the shadow's integration, not happiness exactly, something more solid than happiness, something that does not depend on anyone else's assessment of her worth to remain standing. The philosopher Søren Kierkegaard wrote about what he called the leap, the moment when a person stops managing their life from the perspective of what is safe and begins to live it from the perspective of what is true. It is a leap because there is no rational guarantee on the other side. You cannot know before you make it whether the people in your life will still be there when you land. You cannot know whether the authentic version of you will be received with the warmth that the performed version reliably generated. You can only know that the performance is killing you, slowly, from the inside, and that whatever is on the other side of the leap cannot be worse than remaining where you are. Jung would have agreed with Kierkegaard, with the caveat that the leap is not made once, it is made daily. In every conversation where the truth is slightly uncomfortable, in every relationship where the easy response would be to absorb rather than to speak, in every moment when the old pattern of performance offers itself, familiar, seductive, briefly soothing, and the integrated self pauses, feels the pull and chooses differently. This is what makes shadow work genuinely difficult. It is not a process that ends. It is a direction. And the direction, once you have genuinely turned toward it, changes every aspect of how you move through the world. It changes the relationships you are able to sustain, because the relationships that were built on your smallness, on your willingness to absorb rather than reciprocate, to give endlessly without receiving, to be needed rather than loved, those relationships will not survive your becoming. And this is painful, but it is also, Jung insisted, necessary. Because a relationship that requires you to remain psychologically wounded in order to function is not a relationship. It is a hostage situation. It changes how you experience solitude. The excessively nice person typically fears being alone with their own interior, the very emptiness that the performance was designed to fill. The fear of confronting an authentic self that might be insufficient makes solitude feel like punishment. But as the shadow begins to integrate, as the authentic self becomes more known and less terrifying, solitude begins to feel like what it was always meant to be: replenishment. The Zen tradition speaks of this as the natural return of water to its own level, the ground state of the self, neither performing for others nor armored against itself, simply present. It changes what you are able to receive. Because the person who does not know themselves cannot receive love. They can only receive approval. And approval is not love. Approval is a response to the performance. Love is a response to the person. And you cannot be loved as a person while you are busy hiding the person inside a performance. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke understood this distinction with unusual precision. He wrote about the necessity of turning toward your own life, not as a project of achievement or a performance for others, but as a work of attention. He believed that genuine creativity, and by extension genuine living, required a willingness to sit with the unresolved, the uncomfortable, the not yet integrated, without reaching for a premature resolution that would cut the process short. Jung would have said Rilke was describing individuation in the language of art. And perhaps that is the most honest way to describe what we are talking about. Individuation is an art form. It is the art of living truthfully inside a world that rewards performance. It is the art of remaining in contact with your genuine interior while navigating the social pressures that constantly invite you to edit, smooth, diminish, and adjust. It is the art of holding the shadow, not triumphantly, not without difficulty, but consistently, honestly, with a willingness to keep looking at what is there, even when what is there is not comfortable. You are, if you are watching this, probably somewhere in the middle of this process. Not at the beginning. People who have never encountered any of this don't typically find their way to videos like this one. Not at the end. The end does not exist. Somewhere in the complicated, non-linear middle, where you have caught enough glimpses of your own shadow to know it is real, where the performance has become visibly costly enough that you can no longer pretend not to see the cost, where the question of who you actually are, underneath the helpfulness, underneath the agreeableness, underneath the smile that has been going for so long, has begun to feel genuinely urgent. That urgency is not a symptom of something wrong. It is the signal that something is finally going right. Jung wrote that we do not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. Read that again slowly. Not by eliminating the darkness, not by performing the light so consistently that the darkness is permanently suppressed, but by making the darkness conscious, by turning toward it with full, unflinching attention, and recognizing in it not the enemy, but the teacher. Because the shadow is the teacher. Your anger, properly attended to, is teaching you where your genuine boundaries are. Your grief, properly witnessed, is teaching you what you actually loved and lost, and need to mourn. Your resentment, properly examined, is teaching you which relationships are genuinely reciprocal and which ones have been slowly draining you under the pretense of connection. Your suppressed desire is teaching you what your actual life wants to look like, not the life you have been performing for others, but the life that is native to who you actually are. None of this is comfortable. Jung never promised comfort. He promised something considerably more valuable: genuine encounter with the self, the experience of meeting your own life from the inside rather than watching it from behind a mask. There is a particular kind of courage required for this work. Not the dramatic courage of crisis, the kind that arrives automatically in an emergency, when the adrenaline takes over and the body moves before the mind has time to deliberate, but the quiet, daily, remarkably unglamorous courage of choosing, in each ordinary moment, to be more real rather than more safe, to say the slightly uncomfortable truth rather than the smoothly comfortable performance, to allow someone to be disappointed in you rather than reshaping yourself around their expectations, to sit with your own darkness rather than projecting it onto someone else or burying it under another layer of compulsive helpfulness. The Tao Te Ching, the ancient Chinese philosophical text that Jung studied carefully and admired deeply, contains a concept that maps precisely onto this process. The concept of Wu Wei, often translated as non-doing or effortless action. It is not passivity, it is the action that arises naturally from a person's authentic nature, without the distortion of fear or performance. The water that flows effortlessly around obstacles not because it is avoiding them, but because it is entirely committed to its own nature, and therefore cannot be stopped by anything that tries to redirect it. The excessively nice person is not living in Wu Wei. They are living in its opposite, a state of perpetual, exhausting effortfulness. The effort of continuously monitoring others' responses, the effort of continuously editing the self, the effort of holding the performance together across every relationship, every conversation, every casual social interaction. It is tiring in a way that does not respond to rest, because it is not the body that is tired, it is the soul. The integrated person, the person who has done enough shadow work to be living, however imperfectly, from their genuine interior, experiences the world differently, not without effort, not without conflict, but with the particular quality of effort that feels like engagement rather than survival. The difference between swimming with the current of your own nature and swimming against it, constantly, with a smile on your face that is costing you everything. Because here is the final most essential thing Jung discovered about people who are too nice, and it is the one that I want you to carry with you after this video ends. The moment you stop needing everyone to approve of you is the moment you become genuinely free to love them. Read that again. Let it sit. The compulsively nice person cannot love freely. Their love is always entangled with need, the need for reciprocal approval, the need for continued belonging, the need for the confirmation that they are acceptable, tolerable, worth keeping. That entanglement poisons every relationship it touches. It turns generosity into transaction. It turns warmth into negotiation. It turns love itself into a form of emotional labor performed in exchange for security. The integrated person, who knows their own shadow, who has retrieved their own buried worth, who no longer requires external approval to maintain a functioning sense of self, that person can give love cleanly, without needing anything specific in return, without monitoring the transaction, without the underlying terror that if they give too freely, they will be left with nothing, because they know from the inside that they are not nothing, that the self they have been working so hard to protect, and by making themselves small, agreeable, perpetually available, was never actually in the danger they imagined. It was always there, waiting in the shadow, beneath all the performance, fully formed, fully worthy, absolutely sufficient. You have been protecting yourself from yourself. and the protection was costing you everything that the self it was protecting most wanted to have. Jung concluded, in the later years of his work, that individuation was not a psychological luxury for the troubled few. It was the fundamental vocation of the human being, that every person walking the earth was carrying an unlived life inside them, a life native to their genuine nature, that the performance of social acceptability had continuously deferred, suppressed, or buried entirely, and that the suffering generated by that suppression, the depression, the inexplicable emptiness in the middle of objectively successful lives, the hunger that cannot be identified or satisfied by anything the social world offers, was not pathology. It was instruction. It was the psyche's way of insisting, with increasing urgency and increasing physiological cost, that the unlived life be lived. The question is not whether you are capable of this work. You are. Every human being is. The question is whether you are finally ready to stop performing your acceptable self long enough to meet your actual one. And what do you think you would find there, in the place underneath all the niceness, if you were finally brave enough to look?